"Stop, I'll buy those twins," the mountain man said. One man, two children no one else wanted. In a town where everything has a price, he bought something money wasn't supposed to touch. Folks thought it was just a moment of pity. But when those twins called him Dad, everything changed. Now the dust isn't settled, and the wrong men are asking questions, papers, claims, orders. There are folks who don't take kindly to family being made without their say-so. But in a land where a man can buy a gun, a drink, and a piece of land, can he buy the right to protect two innocent souls? Every story brings us a little closer together. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. It's a joy to see how far this family of listeners reaches. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Dry Creek's main street as Gideon Hart guided his horse through the unusually large crowd. His weathered face tightened at the sight of so many people gathered near the sheriff's office. After months alone in the high country, the press of bodies made him uneasy. The creak of his saddle leather broke through the murmuring as he dismounted. His boots kicked up dust, adding to the haze that hung in the air. The weight of his winter's work, dozens of prime beaver pelts, shifted in the packs behind him, forgotten as he caught sight of what held everyone's attention. Two small children huddled together on a rough wooden platform. Their dark eyes were wide with fear. Their small hands gripped each other as if letting go meant being swept away. They couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Their clothes hung loose on thin frames and their bare feet were caked with dirt. Horace Briggs stood beside them, his fancy vest stretched tight across his belly. The saloon keeper's voice carried across the crowd. "Now, folks, these here twins come with proper papers. Their ma's gone, their pa's unknown. Law says they're wards of the territory now." Sheriff Matthews stood to the side, his badge gleaming dully in the sunlight. His jaw was set tight, hands clasped behind his back as if trying to distance himself from what was happening. "Starting bid at $20, Brigg announced, nodding to the auctioneer who raised his gavel. The silence that followed pressed down like a heavy blanket. Townspeople shifted their feet, looked away, whispered to each other. No one raised a hand. Gideon's heart hammered against his ribs. The girl's long, black hair reminded him of Sarah's before the fever took her. The boy's defiant stance, even in fear, brought back memories of their own son, lost in the same outbreak 12 years ago. The auctioneer's arm began to fall. "Stop!" Gideon's voice boomed across the street. Heads turned and a path cleared as he strode forward. "I'll buy those twins!" His boots thudded on the wooden sidewalk as he approached the sheriff. Without hesitation, he pulled his coin purse free and counted out silver dollars into Matthew's palm. "Now hold on just a minute," Brigg protested, his face reddening. "These here children need a proper home. What's a mountain man know about raising kids?" Gideon turned slowly, fixing Brigg with a steady gaze that had faced down grizzlies. "More than a man who'd sell them like cattle." The sheriff cleared his throat. "The bid's been made and met, Mr. Brigg. Law's clear on this." He sounded relieved to have an excuse to end the auction. Gideon climbed onto the platform. Up close, he could see the twins trembling. He knelt down, trying to make himself less imposing. "My name's Gideon," he said softly. "Would you like to come with me?" The boy's eyes narrowed with distrust, but the girl studied him carefully. She had an old soul's gaze, one that seemed to peer right through him. "Both of us?" she whispered. "Both of you," Gideon confirmed. "Together." The girl nodded slowly, and her brother's stance relaxed just slightly. Gideon gathered them up, one in each arm. They were light as bird bones, and his throat tightened at how little they weighed. The girl's breath tickled his ear as she whispered, "Are you our pa now?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Memories of Sarah flooded back, her smile, her dreams of the family they'd build together, all the love they'd planned to give. He swallowed hard against the sudden ache in his chest. The crowd parted as he carried the twins toward his horse. Their whispers followed him, some disapproving, others thoughtful. He could feel Briggs' glare burning into his back, but he didn't turn around. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, stepped forward with a determined expression. "Mr. Hart," she called out, "those children will need proper clothes." She glanced at their bare feet and shoes. Gideon nodded, grateful for the unexpected support. "Much obliged, ma'am. I reckon I've got some learning to do." The atmosphere in the street had shifted. Where there had been uncomfortable silence, now there were quiet conversations. Where people had looked away, now they watched with interest as Gideon settled the twins carefully on his horse. The boy finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "What's your horse's name?" "Thunder," Gideon answered, surprised by the warmth that spread through his chest at the simple question. "Would you like to learn to ride him?" The boy's eyes widened, and for the first time a hint of a smile touched his lips. The sun was sinking toward the horizon as Gideon led Thunder down the street, the twins perched securely in the saddle. His plans for a quick trading stop had changed into something far more significant. He had no idea how to be a father, but looking up at those two small faces, he knew he'd spend the rest of his life trying to figure it out. Gideon led Thunder and the twins toward his supply wagon at the edge of town. The wooden wheels creaked as he adjusted the brake, his movements careful and deliberate. Every few steps, he glanced back at the children, still perched on Thunder's broad back. They watched him with those solemn eyes that seemed too old for their young faces. "Let's get you two down from there," he said softly, reaching up to help them. The boy flinched slightly at his touch, but his sister squeezed his hand, and they both allowed Gideon to lift them to the ground. "My name's Gideon Hart, might I know yours?" The girl straightened her thin dress and spoke first. "I'm Little Bird," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She nudged her brother gently. "Samuel," the boy mumbled, eyes fixed on his dusty feet. Gideon's throat tightened at their hesitance. "You must be hungry." He reached into his wagon and pulled out a leather pouch. The children's eyes followed his movements as he unwrapped strips of dried venison jerky. "Here, it ain't much, but it'll fill your bellies." Little Bird took the offered food carefully, breaking her piece in half to share with Samuel. They ate slowly, savoring each bite as if unsure when they might eat again. The sight made Gideon's chest ache. The evening air grew cooler as shadows lengthened across the street. Gideon retrieved a thick wool blanket from his supplies and wrapped it around their small shoulders. The fabric engulfed them, but their shivering gradually ceased. "Well, well, what have we here?" The sharp voice cut through the quiet moment. A man in a crisp black suit approached, his boots clicking against the packed earth. His clean-shaven face wore an expression of calculated interest. "Mr. Kane," Little Bird whispered, shrinking behind Gideon's leg. Samuel pressed close to his sister, both children trying to make themselves invisible beneath the blanket. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Hart," Gideon answered, resting one hand protectively on Little Bird's shoulder. "Gideon Hart." "Mr. Hart." Kane adjusted his sleeve cuffs with precise movements. "These children are Apache squatters on railroad territory. Their presence here is problematic." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I bought them fair and legal. Sheriff Matthews witnessed it himself." "Ah, yes, the auction." Kane's lip curled slightly. "But without proper guardianship papers, you have no legal right to keep them. The railroad has certain obligations to maintain order in its territories." "They're children," Gideon said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not property." Kane remained unruffled. "You have 1 week to produce the necessary documentation. After that, we'll be forced to remove them to more appropriate care." He tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Good evening." Gideon watched the man stride away, his hand still resting on Little Bird's trembling shoulder. The weight of what he'd taken on settled heavily across his shoulders. These children needed more than just food and blankets. They needed protection from men like Kane who'd use the law as a weapon. "Come on," he said gently, gathering their few belongings. "Let's find us a proper place to sleep." The Mercantile's upstairs room was small but clean, with a narrow cot against one wall. Mrs. Peterson had sent up a basket containing bread, cheese, and 2 small nightshirts that had belonged to her own children. The twins changed behind a screen while Gideon built up the fire in the small stove. When they emerged, swimming in the borrowed nightshirts, they looked even younger than before. Gideon helped them settle onto the cot, tucking the wool blanket around them. He planned to sleep in the chair by the stove, but as he turned away, Little Bird's small hand shot out and grabbed his thumb. "Stay close?" she asked, her dark eyes pleading. Gideon's heart clenched at the fear in her voice. "I'll be right here," he promised, settling onto the floor beside the cot. "Nobody's going to harm you while I'm around." Little Bird didn't release his thumb, holding it like an anchor in a storm. Samuel pressed against his sister's back, his breathing gradually steadying as exhaustion overtook him. Gideon watched as their eyes grew heavy, then finally closed. In the flickering lamplight, he studied their peaceful faces. Little Bird's fingers remained wrapped around his thumb, trusting and vulnerable. The protective surge he felt surprised him with its intensity. He'd locked away such feelings after Sarah and their son died, convinced he'd never open his heart again. Yet here he sat, his thumb captured by a 5-year-old girl who'd somehow slipped past all his defenses. Her brother's soft snores filled the quiet room, and Gideon realized with startling clarity that he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. From Cain, from the railroad, from anyone who tried to separate them. The lamp burned low as Gideon kept his vigil, his mind already working on how to secure the guardianship papers that would make these children legally his. He couldn't fail them. Not when they'd already lost so much. The morning sun filtered through the mercantile's dusty window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Gideon watched the twins sleep, their small forms still curled together beneath the wool blanket. He'd barely closed his eyes all night, his mind churning with worry over Cain's threat. A gentle knock at the door made him rise quietly. Mrs. Peterson stood in the hallway, her round face creased with concern. "Miss Banning, the school teacher. She might be able to help," she whispered. "Lives in the White House past the church. Known for helping folks in need, she is." Gideon nodded his thanks. When the twins woke, he gave them the last of his jerky and promised to return soon. Mrs. Peterson agreed to watch them while he sought out the school teacher. The White House sat neat and trim behind a small garden. Gideon removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his trail-worn appearance. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing a woman in her late 30s with intelligent eyes and graying temples. "I saw you coming up the path," she said, her voice warm but direct. "I'm Eliza Banning. You must be Mr. Hart. Word travels fast in Dry Creek." "Yes, ma'am." Gideon shifted uncomfortably. "About them children." "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "This isn't a conversation for the street." Inside, the house was modest but welcoming, with books lining every available shelf. Eliza gestured to a chair and poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot warming on the stove. "Tell me everything," she said, settling across from him. Gideon explained about the auction, Cain's threat, and his desperate need for guardianship papers. Eliza's face darkened at the mention of Cain, but she listened without interrupting. "What you did was brave," she said when he finished. "And right. But Cain's not wrong about the law being on his side." She tapped her fingers thoughtfully against her cup. "Though there might be a way. First, let's tend to those children's immediate needs. I have some clothes that should fit them." They returned to the mercantile together. The twins were awake, watching the door anxiously. Their faces brightened when they saw Gideon, but they regarded Eliza with cautious curiosity. "Hello, Little Bird, Samuel," Eliza said softly, kneeling to their level. "I'm Miss Banning. Would you like to get cleaned up and try on some new clothes?" Little Bird looked to Gideon for reassurance. At his nod, she took her brother's hand and followed Eliza to the washroom. An hour later, the twins emerged transformed. Their faces were scrubbed clean, hair neatly combed. Samuel wore sturdy brown trousers and a blue shirt, while Little Bird's dress was faded but well mended, with a ribbon in her dark hair. "Hungry?" Eliza asked, producing a basket filled with bread, cheese, and apples. The children's eyes widened at the sight of fresh food. As they ate at the small table, Eliza explained her thinking to Gideon. "The railroad's claim is based on treating them as unauthorized residents," she said quietly. "But if we can prove their parents were legally married, their rights as citizens would be much harder to dismiss." Gideon frowned. "How would we prove such a thing?" Church records. Eliza's eyes sparked with purpose. Reverend Matthews has kept marriage records for 20 years. If their parents' union was blessed by any church in the territory, there'd be documentation. The twins had grown sleepy after their meal. Eliza produced a colorful patchwork quilt from her basket, and they curled beneath it on the cot. Samuel's thumb crept into his mouth as his eyes drifted closed. "We'll need to know more about their parents," Eliza said softly, watching them sleep. "But that can wait until they trust us more. For now, we'll start searching the records." Gideon ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of all that needed doing. "I'm much obliged, Miss Banning. But why help us?" Eliza was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "I lost my husband 3 years ago. Never had children of our own. Perhaps that's made me more attuned to little ones in need." She straightened her shoulders. "Besides, what Kane's doing isn't right. Sometimes the law needs nudging toward justice." Gideon studied her face, seeing the same determination he felt reflected in her expression. The morning's hopelessness had lifted somewhat, replaced by cautious purpose. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. "We'll start with the church records tomorrow," Eliza continued. "For now, let them rest. They've been through more than any child should." They sat in companionable silence, watching the twins sleep beneath the bright quilt. Little Bird's hand still clutched Samuel's sleeve, protecting him even in sleep. The sight strengthened Gideon's resolve. Whatever it took, he would find a way to keep them safe. The church's back room smelled of old paper and dust. Shafts of afternoon sunlight streamed through small windows, illuminating dancing motes in the air. Gideon watched as Eliza carefully opened another leather-bound ledger, her fingers tracing down columns of faded handwriting. "These records go back 20 years, she said, turning a brittle page. "If there was a legal marriage, Reverend Matthews would have recorded it here." Gideon shifted uncomfortably in the cramped space. Wooden shelves lined the walls, stuffed with books and papers. His broad shoulders felt too big for the tiny room, and the quiet made him restless. He was used to open spaces and mountain winds, not this closed-in feeling. "Maybe I should check on the twins," he said, thinking of Little Bird and Samuel playing under Mrs. Peterson's watchful eye at the mercantile. "They're safe," Eliza assured him, not looking up from her methodical search. "Mrs. Peterson raised 6 children of her own. She knows how to keep little ones occupied." Hour after hour passed. Gideon paced, dusted shelves, and tried to help search, though the cramped writing made his eyes hurt. The sun had moved halfway across the sky when Eliza suddenly gasped. "Here!" Her voice trembled with excitement. "Look at this entry from 5 years ago." Gideon leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the careful script. "Thomas Gilroy," he read slowly, "married to Morning Star of the Apache people, witnessed and blessed by Reverend Matthews himself." "The date matches," Eliza said, her finger underlining the entry. "And look, there's a note about the bride's tribal affiliation. Reverend Matthews was always thorough with his record-keeping." "A railroad worker," Gideon mused, remembering Kane's earlier threats. That explains why the twins were near the tracks when Brigg found them. "This changes everything," Eliza's eyes shone. "A legal marriage means the children are legitimate citizens. Their rights are protected under territorial law. Kane can't simply dismiss them as squatters now." Hope lifted Gideon's heart. But as they stepped out of the church into the late afternoon sun, that hope faltered. Across the street, outside the saloon, stood Horace Brigg and Mr. Kane. They were deep in conversation with a cavalry sergeant, all 3 men gesturing toward the church. "That's Sergeant Barnes," Eliza whispered. "He handles Indian affairs in the territory." Gideon's jaw tightened. He recognized the look of men plotting something. He'd seen it often enough in his trading days, the careful gathering of allies before springing a trap. "We should get back to the twins," he said quietly, "and maybe make a copy of that record." Eliza nodded, understanding in her eyes. They hurried back inside to carefully transcribe the marriage entry, then made their way to Eliza's house. She'd invited them for supper, insisting the twins needed a proper meal. The White House felt different in the evening light, more homey, Delicious smells wafted from the kitchen where a pot of stew simmered on the stove. The twins sat at the scrubbed wooden table, clean and dressed in their new clothes, watching Eliza stir cornbread batter with fascinated eyes. "Would you like to help?" she asked them, smiling. Little Bird nodded shyly, and soon both children were carefully dropping spoonfuls of batter into a hot skillet. Over bowls of rich beef stew and warm cornbread, Eliza broached the subject that had clearly been on her mind. "Mr. Hart," she began, then softened her tone. "Gideon. Looking after two small children while fighting legal battles. It's a lot for one person." Gideon paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. The twins were absorbed in sopping up gravy with pieces of cornbread. "I have the spare room upstairs," Eliza continued. "It would be proper, with me being a widow and a teacher, to help care for them temporarily, at least until things settle." Gideon looked at the twins, then back at Eliza. The offer touched something deep in his chest. "That's mighty kind, Miss Banning, but I couldn't impose." "It's not imposing if it's freely offered," she said firmly. "And please, call me Eliza." Later, as the evening settled into soft purple twilight, Gideon found himself attempting something he'd never done before, tucking children into bed. The spare room was small but clean, with two narrow cots and a patchwork quilt on each one. Little Bird giggled as he awkwardly pulled her blanket up. "You're doing it wrong, Pa," she said, then covered her mouth, uncertain if she should have used that word. "Show me then," Gideon said gruffly, his heart turning over at the name. Samuel demonstrated from his cot, pulling his blanket up to his chin with exaggerated care. "Like this," he said, speaking up for one of the first times since their rescue. Gideon tried again with Little Bird's blanket, making her laugh softly at his clumsy efforts. The sound of children's laughter in the quiet house made the room feel warmer somehow, more like a home than just a place to sleep. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dry Creek's dusty main street as Gideon strode toward the telegraph office. The small wooden building, with its distinctive wire lines stretching toward the horizon, stood between the general store and the blacksmith shop. Inside, the steady click-clack of the telegraph key filled the cramped space. "Need to send a message," Gideon told the operator, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, "to Judge Morrison in Prescott Territory." The operator, Mr. Wells, nodded and picked up his pencil. "Go ahead." Gideon had rehearsed the words carefully with Eliza that morning. "Request urgent clarification. Stop Apache mixed children with documented legitimate parentage. Stop rights under territorial guardianship law. Stop. Reply needed within 3 days. Stop. Signed Gideon Hart, Dry Creek. Stop." While Wells tapped out the message, Gideon's thoughts drifted to the schoolhouse where Eliza was watching the twins. She had suggested teaching them their letters, something that might help prove they were being properly cared for. The bell above the door chimed as several townspeople entered the telegraph office. Mrs. Peterson from the Mercantile gave Gideon a warm smile. "Those children looked mighty happy at breakfast this morning," she said quietly. "It does my heart good to see them clean and cared for." Behind her, the blacksmith's wife nodded in agreement. "My Thomas says what you did at that auction was the Christian thing," she added. "Not everyone agrees with Mr. Kane's methods." Gideon shifted uncomfortably under their approval. He wasn't used to being the center of town talk. "Much obliged," he mumbled, paying Wells for the telegram. Outside, more signs of support emerged. The baker pressed a paper bag of fresh rolls into his hands. "For the little ones," he said gruffly. The livery stable owner offered to watch Gideon's wagon and team for free. These small kindnesses felt strange but warming, like sun breaking through storm clouds. At the schoolhouse, Gideon found Eliza sitting between the twins at her desk. Little Bird's tongue poked out in concentration as she carefully traced letters on a slate. Samuel watched his sister intently, then mimicked her movements with his own chalk. "Look, Pa." Little Bird held up her slate proudly. There, in wobbly but recognizable letters, was her name. "That's fine work," Gideon said, his throat tight. He set the bag of rolls on Eliza's desk. "Brought you all something from town." The children's eyes lit up at the smell of fresh bread, but before they could reach for the treats, a commotion arose outside. Through the schoolhouse window, Gideon saw several men gathering around a post where Cain was nailing up a notice. "Stay here," he told Eliza and the twins. The air felt charged as he crossed the street. The notice, printed on official railroad company paper, declared, "By right of eminent domain, the Western Pacific Railroad Company hereby claims all lands previously worked by Thomas Gilroy, deceased, including all associated property and dependent claims. Any persons occupying said lands without railroad authority will be removed by territorial forces." Cain turned from posting the notice, meeting Gideon's eyes with cold satisfaction. "Just following company policy, Mr. Hart. Nothing personal." The gathering crowd parted as Gideon stalked toward the saloon where Cain was heading. Inside, the afternoon shadows couldn't hide the tension as Gideon confronted the railroad agent at the bar. "Those children have rights," Gideon said, his voice low but carrying in the sudden quiet. "Their father's marriage was legal and recorded." Cain sipped his whiskey casually. The company's rights supersede any previous claims, especially those of mixed heritage. He set his glass down deliberately. "I've already telegraphed Fort Verde. Soldiers will arrive within 3 days to escort the children to more appropriate accommodations." "You mean an orphanage?" Gideon growled. Several men at nearby tables shifted uneasily. "Better than living wild with a mountain man who can barely write his own name." Cain's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Face facts, Hart. You're not fit to raise those children. The company is doing everyone a favor by resolving this situation." Gideon's hands clenched into fists. The saloon had grown so quiet, you could hear the buzz of flies against the windows. Cain's hand drifted toward his coat pocket. 3 days, Cain repeated softly. "I suggest you use them wisely. Say your goodbyes, pack them up, make it easier on everyone." He pushed away from the bar. "Or don't. The soldiers will come either way." As Cain walked out, conversations slowly resumed, but the atmosphere remained tense. Gideon stood rigid, aware of eyes watching him, measuring his reaction. Finally, he turned and walked out into the afternoon sun. 3 days. They had 3 days to find a way to keep the twins safe, or everything he'd done would count for nothing. Back at Eliza's small house, the afternoon sun streamed through lace curtains as she paced the wooden floor. Her mind worked quickly, weighing options against the 3-day deadline. The twins sat at her kitchen table, sharing the last of the baker's rolls while Gideon cleaned his rifle nearby, his movements sharp with tension. "We need the town behind us," Eliza said finally, stopping her pacing. "A community united holds more sway than individual protests." Gideon looked up from his work, skepticism clear in his weathered face. "Folks don't much care for causing trouble with the railroad." "But they care about children," Eliza countered, her voice gaining strength. "And they respect the law. We have proof of Thomas Gilroy's marriage in those church records. If we show them the truth, present our case properly." She straightened her apron with determination. "We need to call a town meeting." "A meeting?" Gideon set his rifle aside. "Most likely just give Cain another chance to turn folks against us. Or give us the chance to turn them toward justice." Eliza moved to the stove, stirring the bubbling stew pot. "People are already sympathizing with the twins. Mrs. Peterson, the baker, even Reverend Clark. They just need the courage to stand together." Little Bird looked up from her roll, crumbs on her chin. "Are we going to stay with you and Pa?" The simple question, and especially that word, Pa, made Gideon's hands still. He glanced at Samuel, who nodded earnestly, echoing his sister's hope. It was the first time either child had called him that without prompting. Eliza watched emotion flicker across Gideon's face. The twins had worked their way into his heart, just as they had hers. She ladled stew into bowls, buying time for Gideon to compose himself. "Reckon we'll do whatever it takes," he finally managed, his voice rough. They ate together in the warm kitchen, the twins telling stories about their day at school. Samuel proudly showed Gideon how he could write his name, while Little Bird demonstrated counting to 10 using stew vegetables. "You're learning fast," Gideon praised them, and Eliza's heart warmed at how natural he sounded now, how fatherly. "That's why we need to show everyone," she said softly. Let them see what we see. Gideon met her eyes across the table. Something shifted in his expression. A softening, a surrender to hope. "All right," he said. "We'll try your meeting." The quiet evening was shattered by heavy knocking at the front door. The twins startled, instinctively moving closer to Gideon. He stood, one hand reaching for his rifle, but Eliza shook her head. Through the window, she could make out the deputy's familiar silhouette in the gathering dusk. She opened the door to find young Deputy Miller looking uncomfortable, an official paper in his hand. "Evening, Miss Banning. Mr. Hart in there with you?" Gideon appeared behind her. "What's this about, Deputy?" Miller held out the paper apologetically. "Official summons from Fort Verde, delivered by telegraph. Says the twins are to be turned over to Army custody in 3 days' time, unless—" He hesitated, checking the paper. "Unless contested by legal authority with documented proof of guardianship rights." Gideon took the paper, his jaw tight. The twins peered around his legs, their earlier happiness replaced by fear. "Much obliged, Deputy," Eliza said firmly, making it clear the conversation was over. Miller tipped his hat and retreated into the darkness. Gideon read the summons twice, then handed it to Eliza. The twins pressed against him, seeking comfort. Without thinking, he rested his hands on their shoulders. "Pa?" Little Bird's voice quavered. "Are the soldiers gonna take us away?" Samuel clutched his sister's hand. "We'll be good. Promise." Gideon knelt down to their level, his large hands gentle as he gathered them close. "Nobody's taking you anywhere," he said with quiet conviction. "You hear me? Nobody." Eliza watched the three of them together. The mountain man who'd lived so long alone, now holding these children like they were his whole world. The sight strengthened her resolve. "We'll hold the meeting tomorrow," she declared. "I'll speak to Reverend Clark tonight about using the church. We'll post notices first thing in the morning." She touched Gideon's shoulder. "The whole town needs to see this, needs to see them and you together. It's our best chance." Gideon nodded slowly, still holding the twins. "Reckon you're right." He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the same fierce determination she felt. "We'll make them understand." Little Bird and Samuel stayed pressed close to their newfound father, their small faces set with trust that he would protect them. The official summons lay on the table between cooling bowls of stew, its threat hanging in the air. But in that moment, watching Gideon comfort the twins, Eliza knew the town meeting wasn't just their best chance. It was their only chance to keep this fragile family together. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as Gideon and Eliza tacked meeting notices to storefront posts along Dry Creek's main street. The morning air held a bite of mountain chill, and their breath came out in small clouds. Little Bird and Samuel helped by handing up the papers, their small faces earnest with concentration. "Town meeting," the notices proclaimed in Eliza's neat handwriting. "Wednesday at 2 o'clock, Church Hall. Important matter of community justice." "Reckon that'll catch folks' attention," Gideon said, hammering the last nail with perhaps more force than necessary. Eliza adjusted her shawl against the morning chill. "Now comes the harder part. We need to convince them to come." They started their rounds at Whitaker's General Store, where the twins' good manners immediately caught Mrs. Whitaker's eye. While Samuel politely asked about a jar of peppermint sticks, Little Bird helped the shopkeeper's wife sweep behind the counter. "Lord above," Mrs. Whitaker exclaimed, watching the little girl work. "Cain said they were wild things, but these children are sweet as Sunday pie." Gideon squared his shoulders. "Ma'am, we're holding a meeting day after tomorrow. About their future. Would mean a lot if you and Mr. Whitaker came." Mrs. Whitaker studied the twins, then nodded slowly. "Well, I suppose we ought to hear what's what." At the blacksmith's shop, the hammering stopped as they approached. Tom Peterson wiped his sooty hands on his leather apron, listening intently as Gideon explained about the marriage records and Cain's threats. "Ain't right," Peterson growled, watching the twins examine his tools with careful hands. "That Cain always pushing folks around with railroad money." He tested the twins' grip strength, showing them how to hold a small hammer properly. "Count me in, Hart, about time somebody stood up to him." The morning wore on as they made their way through town. At the church, Reverend Clark welcomed them into his study, offering the twins dried apple slices while Gideon and Eliza explained their cause. "The Lord's house should be a place of justice," the Reverend said, watching Samuel share his apple with his sister. "I've seen how you care for them, Mr. Hart. Perhaps this is his plan, bringing these little ones to our community." By midday, they'd spoken to most of the prominent townspeople. Some were hesitant, others surprisingly supportive. The twins' presence made the difference. Their quiet dignity and obvious attachment to Gideon challenged the prejudices Cain had been spreading. At the baker's shop, Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife, slipped each child a fresh cookie. "My Tom told me what's brewing," she said in a low voice. "We'll be there. Them railroad men can't just snatch children whenever they please." The sun was setting when they finally returned to Eliza's cottage, tired but hopeful. After a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Gideon settled into Eliza's reading chair, a twin on each knee. From her shelf, he selected a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. "Ain't much of a reader," he admitted gruffly, but opened the book anyway. The twins leaned against his chest as he slowly sounded out the words, his finger tracing each line. When he stumbled, Eliza gently prompted him from her mending chair. The simple story of survival and friendship seemed to captivate the children. Little Bird's eyes grew wide at descriptions of the island, while Samuel asked questions about sailing ships and storms. Before long, their questions turned to drowsy murmurs. Gideon carried them to their bed in the spare room, tucking the quilt around their sleeping forms. He stood watching them for a long moment, his weathered face soft in the lamplight. Back in the sitting room, Eliza set aside her mending. "You've done well with them today," she said quietly. "Did you see how people responded?" Gideon eased into his chair with a tired sigh. "Saw some minds changing, maybe. Still ain't sure it'll be enough." "They're seeing what I saw that first day," Eliza continued. "A man willing to stand up for what's right, and 2 children who deserve a chance at family." She smiled. Even old Mr. Jenkins smiled at them, and I haven't seen him smile since his wife passed last winter. "Little Bird has a way about her," Gideon admitted. "Samuel too. Quiet-like, but they get under your skin." "They're melting more than just the town's coldness," Eliza observed softly, watching Gideon's face in the lamplight. "I've seen how you've changed these past few days." Gideon studied his calloused hands. "Never thought to be reading bedtime stories at my age." "Life has a way of surprising us," Eliza said, her needle flashing in the lamplight as she resumed her mending. "Sometimes with exactly what we need." Through the thin walls, they could hear the twins' soft breathing. Outside, a coyote called lonely in the distance, but inside the cottage, warmth and hope filled the quiet evening air. The morning of the town meeting dawned clear and crisp. Gideon's hands trembled slightly as he helped the twins into their freshly pressed clothes, hand-me-downs from the Whitaker children, but clean and proper for the occasion. Little Bird wore a blue cotton dress with carefully mended lace at the collar, while Samuel's suspenders gleamed with new brass buckles. "You both look real fine," Gideon said gruffly, his throat tight with emotion. The twins stood straight and solemn, understanding without words the importance of the day. Eliza arrived at their door carrying the precious marriage ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Her usually neat hair showed signs of nervous adjusting, but her eyes were bright with determination. "Ready?" she asked, smoothing Little Bird's dress one last time. They walked to the church hall together, the twins holding hands between them. Already wagons and buggies lined the street outside. Gideon's heart lifted slightly at the turnout. Not packed, but more than he'd dared hope for. Inside, wooden pews had been arranged in rows facing the pulpit. The Petersons sat near the front, along with Mrs. Whitaker and several other shopkeepers. Reverend Clark stood by the door, greeting arrivals with quiet dignity. Near the back, Horace Brigg lounged with calculated indifference, while Cain sat rigid and formal, his railroad agent's badge catching the light from tall windows. As they made their way forward, Little Bird pressed closer to Gideon's leg. He rested his hand on her shoulder, drawing strength from her trust. Samuel walked tall beside his sister, chin lifted in an echo of his new father's stance. Reverend Clark called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of his knuckles on the pulpit. "We are gathered today," he began, "to address a matter of significant concern to our community." Eliza rose first, unfolding the marriage ledger with careful hands. Her school teacher's voice carried clear and strong through the hall. "This record shows the legal marriage of Thomas Gilroy to Morning Star of the Apache Nation, performed in this very church 3 years ago." She turned the book so others could see. "These children are their legitimate offspring, born under territorial law." Kane's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. Marriage or no marriage, the railroad's claim to Gilroy's land holding supersedes any— "This ain't about land," Gideon interrupted, rising slowly. His voice, unused to public speaking, grew stronger as he continued. "This is about 2 children who need a home, about doing what's right by our neighbors, no matter who their kin might be." He looked down at the twins, then back at the gathered faces. "I'm not much for fancy words. Been a mountain man most of my life, living alone with just my thoughts and the good Lord's company. But these little ones," his voice caught, "they deserve better than being traded like pelts or shipped off like cargo." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Peterson nodded firmly while her husband crossed his arms and glared at Kane. Brigg pushed away from his wall, his voice oily with false concern. Now, let's not get emotional. There are procedures, laws." The door swung open with a bang. Sergeant Barnes strode in, trail dust still coating his cavalry uniform. "Speaking of laws," he announced, holding up an official-looking document, "I have orders here, signed by the territorial governor, for these children to be relocated to the Fort Apache Reservation." The room erupted in overlapping voices. Kane smiled thinly. "You see? The matter is settled." "It ain't settled," the blacksmith growled, standing. "We all saw how Gideon's cared for them kids this past week. They're thriving here." Mrs. Whitaker's voice rose above the clamor. "Those children helped in my store yesterday. Polite as any I've seen. It would be a sin to tear them from a good home." The debate grew heated. Kane cited railroad authority while Brigg made snide remarks about proper placing of mixed-blood children. But more voices joined in support of Gideon: the baker, the livery stable owner, even the usually quiet telegraph operator. Through it all, Little Bird and Samuel stood silent, pressed against Gideon's sides. Their dignity in the face of being discussed like property seemed to affect the crowd more than any argument. Several women dabbed at their eyes, while more than one hard-faced rancher shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The law may say one thing," Reverend Clark interjected, raising his hands for quiet, "but our conscience, our community, says another. These children have found a father who loves them. Who among us has the right to deny that blessing?" The mood in the room had shifted palpably. Where Kane and Brigg's words had once found ready agreement, now they met with frowns and shaking heads. The twins' presence had transformed abstract arguments about property and procedure into a visible question of moral choice. Gideon felt Eliza's hand touch his arm briefly, lending support. He looked out at his neighbors' faces, seeing reflection and recognition replace prejudice and fear. The battle wasn't won, but in that moment he knew they'd gained something precious, the beginning of understanding. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as Gideon stepped onto the mercantile's wooden porch. The twins still slept upstairs, wrapped in warm quilts. He breathed in the crisp morning air, his mind heavy with yesterday's town meeting and its unresolved tensions. The clip-clop of hooves drew his attention. Sergeant Barnes approached on horseback, his blue cavalry uniform neat despite the early hour. The sergeant dismounted with practiced ease, leading his horse to the hitching post. "Might we speak privately, Mr. Hart?" Barnes asked, his voice low and controlled. Gideon nodded, gesturing toward the quiet side of the building where crates of merchandise waited for unpacking. The morning shadows stretched long across the dirt, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage. Barnes removed his cavalry hat, revealing lines of worry etched deep in his weathered face. "What I'm about to say," he began, then paused, checking that no one was within earshot. "It ain't exactly official business." Gideon waited, noting the conflict in the sergeant's eyes. "I've been part of Indian removals for 15 years now," Barnes continued, his voice rough with emotion. Seen too many families torn apart. Done things that... He shook his head. Things that haunt a man's dreams. The sergeant's fingers worked the brim of his hat nervously. Those twins of yours, they remind me of another pair. 2 years back near Fort Apache. I was following orders, you understand? His eyes met Gideon's, seeking not forgiveness but understanding. Reckon a man can only follow orders so long before his conscience speaks up, Gideon replied quietly. Barnes nodded. There's something you should know, a loophole in territorial law. He glanced around again before continuing. Emergency adoption under church authority, specifically through baptismal records, it carries weight. Legal weight. Even the Army has to respect it if it's done proper and recorded before we take official custody. Gideon's heart quickened. You're saying if the twins were baptized and adopted through the church, then my hands would be tied legally. Barnes's voice dropped even lower. But it has to be done before we take custody. And those orders? He straightened his shoulders. We ride at dawn, day after tomorrow. 2 days, Gideon breathed, mind racing through possibilities. Father Mendoza's mission, Barnes said. He's known for helping in such matters, understands the law better than most, but it's a full day's wagon ride from here. The sound of small feet on creaking floorboards drifted down from above. The twins would be awaking soon, unaware of how their fate hung in the balance. Why are you telling me this? Gideon asked, studying the sergeant's face. Barnes squared his shoulders. Maybe I'm tired of seeing children used as pawns in land disputes. Maybe I'm hoping to balance some scales before I face my final judgment. He replaced his hat with deliberate care. But officially, we never had this conversation. Much obliged, Sergeant, Gideon said softly. Dawn, day after tomorrow, Barnes repeated. After that, orders are orders. He turned to go, then paused. Those twins deserve a father like you, Hart. Make it count. Gideon watched the sergeant mount up and ride away, his mind already plotting the journey ahead. Father Mendoza's mission lay west across difficult country. The wagon would need careful packing, food, water, blankets for the nights that were still cold at higher elevations. Above him, Little Bird's laugh drifted down through the window, followed by Samuel's quieter voice. The sound strengthened Gideon's resolve. He'd crossed worse country and worse weather. This time, he had something more precious than furs to protect. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, finding the twins already dressed in their simple clothes. Little Bird was helping Samuel with a stubborn button, her small fingers working with careful determination. How would you two like to take a wagon ride? Gideon asked, his heart warming at their eager faces. Where to, Pa? Samuel asked, the word Pa still new and wonderful in Gideon's ears. To see a friend, a priest who's going to help make us a real family. Gideon knelt down to their level. But we need to leave soon. Today. Little Bird's dark eyes studied his face. Because of the soldiers? Sometimes Gideon forgot how much the twins understood. Yes, little one, but don't you worry. Your pa's got a plan. He gathered them close, breathing in the clean scent of their hair. 2 days to reach the mission. 2 days to secure their future. 2 days to make sure these precious children would never be taken from him. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting their shadows as one upon the rough wooden floor. Outside, a meadowlark called, welcoming the new day, a day that would either save his newfound family or tear it apart. Gideon burst into the blacksmith's shop, the door banging against the wall. Jake Miller looked up from his anvil. Hammer paused mid-strike. Sweat glistened on his soot-stained face despite the morning chill. Need your wagon, Jake, it's urgent. Gideon's voice carried the weight of desperation. The blacksmith set down his hammer, wiping his hands on his leather apron. Heard about the meeting yesterday. He gestured toward the back of the shop. Take it. Sturdiest one I got. Just brought her in for new wheel bands last week. Much obliged, Gideon said, already moving to inspect the wagon. Jake called after him. Them twins deserve better than what Kane and Brigg got planned. You do right by them, Hart. Throughout the day, word spread quietly through Dry Creek. The mercantile owner's wife appeared at Eliza's door with a basket of dried goods and preserves. The cooper's daughter brought warm quilts, freshly washed. Even the telegraph operator slipped Gideon a warning while delivering an incoming message. "Kane's been sending wires all morning," he whispered. "Army patrol's been notified. They're watching the East Road." Inside Eliza's cottage, preparation moved with urgent purpose. She packed her medical kit, extra clothes for the twins, and what remained of yesterday's bread. Little Bird and Samuel sat at the kitchen table, rolling dried beans into small cloth bags, their faces serious with concentration. "Will it be very far, Miss Eliza?" Little Bird asked, her small fingers working steadily. Eliza smoothed the girl's dark hair. "It's a long ride, sweetheart, but we'll all be together." Samuel looked up from his task. "Even you? You're coming too?" "Yes, dear one. Someone needs to keep you warm while your pa drives the wagon." The afternoon sun cast long shadows by the time they finished loading. Gideon checked the wagon's contents one final time. Water barrels, feed for the horses, blankets, food, and a small box of medical supplies. Everything secured against the rough trail ahead. They waited until full dark. The town settled into evening quiet, broken only by distant coyote songs and the occasional creak of windmills. At last, Gideon gave the signal. Eliza helped the twins into the wagon bed, now padded with straw and blankets. She climbed in after them, gathering them close as Gideon took the reins. The horses' hooves were muffled with cloth, a trick from his trapping days. They moved slowly through town, every creak of the wagon seeming loud as thunder in the darkness. Past the silent buildings, past the railroad office where a single lamp still burned, past the edge of town where the west road beckoned. Only then did Gideon let the horses pick up speed. The wagon swayed gently as they found their rhythm, wheels turning steadily toward Father Mendoza's mission. Behind them, Dry Creek's lights faded into the vast darkness of the territory. The night grew colder. Stars wheeled overhead, bright and distant. Every hour, Gideon pulled up to listen for pursuit, but heard only nightbirds and the whisper of wind through sage. The twins huddled against Eliza, wrapped in layers of quilts. "Sing us that song again," Little Bird whispered to her brother. "The one Mama taught us." Samuel's voice rose soft and clear in the darkness, a melody in Apache that Gideon didn't understand but felt in his bones. Little Bird joined in, their young voices twining together like smoke rising to the stars. Eliza held them closer, humming along though she didn't know the words. The song seemed to calm their fears, pushing back the darkness. It reminded Gideon of other nights, other campfires, when music was the only bridge between different peoples sharing the same land. Every few miles, Gideon checked their back trail. The moon cast enough light to see riders if they came, but the road remained empty. Still, his hand never strayed far from his rifle. Kane and Brigg wouldn't let them go easily, and the Army patrol could cut across country if they learned which way the wagon had gone. The twins' song faded as exhaustion took hold. They slept now, curled together under the quilts, their faces peaceful in the moonlight. Eliza kept watch over them, her own eyes heavy but determined. "You should rest too," Gideon said softly. "Long day ahead tomorrow." "I'll rest when we reach the mission," she replied. "When these little ones are safe." Gideon glanced back at her, noting how naturally she cradled the sleeping twins. Something warm stirred in his chest, a feeling of rightness he hadn't expected. They were more than just a group fleeing in the night. They were becoming a family. The wagon rolled on through the darkness, each turn of the wheels carrying them closer to hope, closer to safety. Behind them, the eastern sky remained dark and empty. Ahead, the road wound westward toward morning, toward Father Mendoza's mission, toward a future that might just hold enough room for all of them. The wagon wheels crunched over loose stones as they rounded a bend in the trail. Moonlight filtered through the branches overhead, casting strange shadows across the path. Gideon pulled hard on the reins, bringing the horses to an abrupt halt. "Sweet mercy," Eliza whispered from the wagon bed. Ahead, several large pine trees lay scattered across the trail, their trunks forming an impassable barrier. Fresh sawdust glittered in the moonlight, and the sharp scent of pine sap filled the air. "Cain's men," Gideon said grimly. He climbed down from the wagon seat, rifle in hand. "Get the children into those bushes yonder. Stay quiet until I call." Eliza helped the twins scramble down. Little Bird clutched her brother's hand as they crouched in the dense brush beside the trail. Samuel pressed his face against Eliza's skirts, trembling. Gideon worked methodically in the darkness, using his axe to trim branches and clear a narrow path. Each strike of metal on wood seemed to echo through the silent forest. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the cold night air. Hours slipped away as he labored. The eastern sky began showing the first hints of gray when he finally cleared enough space for the wagon to squeeze through. "All clear," he called softly. "Come on back now." They lost precious time getting the wagon through the tight passage. The wheels caught on stumps, and twice they had to stop to prevent the axle from scraping. By the time they cleared the obstacle, false dawn was painting the sky. "We need to hurry," Eliza said, settling the exhausted twins back into their nest of blankets. "The army patrol will be moving at first light." Gideon nodded, snapping the reins. The horses responded gamely, though their flanks were dark with sweat. The wagon picked up speed on the downslope, wheels rattling over rocks and ruts. Little Bird's head began nodding against her brother's shoulder. Samuel's eyes drooped, despite his evident effort to stay awake. Even Eliza fought to keep her eyes open as the motion of the wagon grew hypnotic. A heavy mist rolled in as they entered a shallow valley, obscuring the trail ahead. Gideon leaned forward, straining to make out landmarks in the murky pre-dawn light. The familiar path had become treacherous and strange, forcing him to rely on old instincts from his trapping days. He guided the horses by feel more than sight, reading the slope of the ground, the density of the brush, the position of the lightening sky through the fog. Every few minutes, he checked their direction against his mental map of the territory, praying his memory would hold true until the mist lifted. The twins slept now, curled together like fox kits in their den. Eliza kept one arm protectively around them as she peered into the swirling fog, watching for any sign of pursuit on their back trail. The first pale light of dawn crept over the eastern hills, painting the sky in soft brushstrokes of pink and gold. Through the lingering mist, a deep, resonant sound reached their ears. "The mission bell?" Eliza whispered, hope brightening her tired face. Gideon's shoulders relaxed slightly at the familiar toll, but tension returned as he caught movement on the ridge behind them. Dark shapes moved against the brightening sky. Mounted soldiers, their uniforms unmistakable even at this distance. "Wake the children," he said, snapping the reins. The exhausted horses responded with renewed energy, perhaps sensing sanctuary ahead. Little Bird and Samuel stirred as Eliza gently roused them. The mission's adobe walls emerged from the morning mist, their weathered surface glowing golden in the dawn light. The bell continued its steady calling as they rattled through the wooden gates into the courtyard. Father Mendoza stood waiting in his black cassock, prayer book in hand. His calm presence steadied them all as they climbed stiffly from the wagon. Behind him, candles flickered on the chapel altar, visible through the open door. "We have little time," the priest said quietly, ushering them inside. "Sergeant Barnes's telegram reached me yesterday. Everything is prepared." The twins stayed close to Gideon as they entered the cool darkness of the chapel. Little Bird's small hand found his calloused one, while Samuel pressed against his leg. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder outside. Father Mendoza worked with swift reverence, his movements both hurried and dignified. Holy water gleamed in the brass basin as he began the ceremony, his voice steady and clear in the hushed chapel. "Do you, Gideon Hart, take these children as your own to raise in faith and love?" "I do," Gideon answered, his deep voice rough with emotion. The thunder of arriving horses filled the courtyard just as Father Mendoza touched the blessed water to Little Bird's forehead. "I baptize you, Little Bird Hart." Samuel followed, his solemn face lifted to the priest. "I baptize you, Samuel Hart." Boot steps echoed on the flagstones outside. The final Amen rang through the chapel as soldiers appeared in the doorway, led by a stern-faced lieutenant. Father Mendoza turned calmly, holding up the freshly signed papers. These children are now legally adopted and baptized as the Hart family, under territorial law and the authority of the Holy Church. His voice carried quiet authority. The papers are witnessed and sealed. The lieutenant examined the documents, jaw clenched. After a long moment, he handed them back with a sharp nod. Everything appears to be in order. He turned to his men. Mount up, we're riding back. The return journey to Dry Creek felt lighter despite their exhaustion. The morning sun warmed their backs as the wagon rolled steadily homeward. Little Bird and Samuel dozed against Eliza, their faces peaceful for the first time since Gideon had found them. As they approached town, people gathered along the dusty main street. Word of their victory at the mission had somehow traveled faster than their wagon. The blacksmith stood outside his shop, hammer raised in greeting. The grocer's wife wiped happy tears with her apron. Even the telegraph operator had stepped outside, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "Look there, children," Eliza whispered, gently rousing the twins. "The whole town's come to welcome you home." Samuel's eyes widened at the crowd, and Little Bird pressed closer to Gideon. He squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "It's all right now. You're safe here." The sheriff pushed through the gathering, his badge catching the sunlight. "Welcome back, Hart family," he called out, emphasizing the word family with deliberate meaning. "Quite a stir you've caused." Before Gideon could respond, angry voices erupted from the saloon. Kane burst onto the boardwalk, his usual precise appearance disheveled, Brigg close behind him. "This changes nothing," Kane shouted, waving a sheaf of papers. "The railroad still holds claim to Gilroy's land. These adoption papers don't override company rights." The sheriff turned slowly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Actually, Mr. Kane, they do." He pulled out a telegram from his vest pocket. "Just received this from the territorial judge. The church marriage records prove Thomas Gilroy's legal union. Combined with Father Mendoza's baptismal adoption, these children are legitimate heirs to their father's homestead claim." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The case is closed." Kane's face reddened as he read the telegram. The paper crumpled in his trembling hands. "This is impossible. The company will appeal." "The company," the sheriff cut in, "might want to know how their agent tried forcing two legal citizens off their rightful property." He stepped closer to Kane, voice lowering. "Might raise some uncomfortable questions in the territorial court." Brigg tried to slink away, but the crowd had closed ranks behind him. The blacksmith crossed his massive arms, blocking the saloon keeper's escape. "Folks here been talking," the sheriff continued, addressing Brigg now, "about certain business practices of yours. Seems there's quite a list of complaints ready for the circuit judge's next visit." Brigg's bluster deflated. "Now see here." "I see plenty," the sheriff interrupted. "I see a man who's worn out his welcome in Dry Creek." He turned to the gathered townspeople. "Anyone disagree?" The silence was heavy with judgment. Brigg's face twisted in rage, but he knew when he was beaten. Without another word, he stormed toward the livery stable, leaving Kane standing alone. The railroad agent straightened his jacket, trying to salvage his dignity. "This isn't over, Hart," he spat, but his words carried no weight now. He turned on his heel and marched stiffly toward the telegraph office. As the crowd dispersed, several people approached the wagon, offering quiet congratulations and small welcomes: a loaf of fresh bread, a jar of preserved peaches, a handmade quilt. The twins watched in wonder as their new neighbors showed kindness instead of fear. That evening, in Eliza's cozy kitchen, the family gathered around a simple supper of beef stew and cornbread. Lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls as Little Bird carefully set 4 places at the table, proud to help. Samuel solemnly carried the bread basket, concentrating on not dropping a single crumb. Gideon watched them, his heart full in a way he'd forgotten was possible. These children, who'd started as strangers just days ago, now moved through his life as naturally as breathing. And Eliza, her quiet strength had become as essential as his own. "Reckon we ought to say grace," he said softly, surprising himself. It had been years since he'd felt moved to pray. They joined hands around the table, the twins' small fingers warm in his calloused grip. Eliza's gentle touch completed the circle. In the peaceful quiet, Gideon found himself thanking God not just for the food, but for the strange and wonderful path that had led them all here. Amen, they whispered together, and in that moment they were more than 4 people sharing a meal. They were a family, bound by love stronger than any law could measure. 6 weeks had passed since that fateful night at Father Mendoza's mission. The crisp autumn morning painted Dry Creek's church steps in golden light as worshipers filed out after Sunday service. The wooden steps creaked beneath small boots as Little Bird and Samuel burst through the doors, their faces bright with excitement. "Pa, Ma, look at me," Little Bird called out, her dark braids bouncing as she waved a piece of paper. Samuel echoed his sister's enthusiasm, clutching his own carefully written schoolwork. Gideon stood at the bottom of the steps, his weathered face softening at the sight of them. The twins had filled out since those first frightening days, their cheeks now rosy, their eyes sparkling with life instead of fear. Their new clothes, sewn by Eliza's careful hands, spoke of belonging rather than desperate need. "Well now, let's see what you've got there," Gideon said, reaching down to scoop them both up. Samuel's paper showed careful rows of letters, while Little Bird had drawn their family standing in front of their home. 4 figures held together by crayon-sketched hands smiled up from the page. Eliza descended the steps more slowly, her Sunday best catching the morning light. She paused beside Gideon, close enough that their shoulders touched. The casual intimacy of the gesture spoke volumes about how their relationship had deepened over these weeks of shared purpose and growing love. "They're learning so quickly," she murmured, her eyes meeting Gideon's. In that glance passed all the unspoken joy of their unexpected journey from allies to family. The twins had begun calling her Ma naturally, just as they'd claimed Gideon as Pa, and the rightness of it warmed them both. Other families passed by, offering gentle nods and warm greetings. The blacksmith tipped his hat, his wife smiling at the children. The grocer's boy waved to Samuel, no longer seeing difference where once there had been division. Even the sheriff, standing by the hitching post, gave an approving nod to the family that had changed his town's heart. Gideon set the twins down gently, taking their small hands in his. These fingers that once knew only the rough grip of traplines and rifle stocks now held something far more precious. He felt Eliza's presence beside them, completing their circle, and marveled at how full his once solitary life had become. Together they walked down the sunlit street toward home, their footsteps falling in easy rhythm. The future stretched before them bright with promise, built on the foundation of love they'd found in each other. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.